Hello and welcome to the Weekly Artifact. This is a new version, just me, Justin, no co-host today. Same premise though. The internet moves fast. The hot takes of today are less than a distant memory by tomorrow. I'm here to slow down, recover the content that's been lost along the way in order to make sense of where the world was, where it is, and where it will be. To that end, I've chosen an artifact from the web to discuss solo this week. My comments are my own and are not associated with any institution. The show may contain explicit language or themes, so see the show notes for specific content warnings. My artifact this week, for today, is titled Dan Le Batard Was Right. Embrace Debate Has Destroyed Sports Television by Karen J. Phillips. This was published July 5th, 2023 on Deadspin. I'm going to try for this show to select articles that are all at least 3 years old, partially to be able to kind of reflect on what's changed since the article was published, and also just because I'm kind of interested in, how the ephemerality of online, most of the stuff we see tends to be things that just came out, yesterday, and if something's older than a week, then it's, old news and no one looks at it anymore. So it's interesting to go back and look at some of this stuff that came out in the grand scheme of things not that long ago, but in internet time quite a bit ago. So this article, I will just summarize it first. It was written kind of in the wake of Bomani Jones's HBO show, which was called Game Theory, being canceled. And at the same time, around the same time, Dan Le Batard had actually called out Stephen A. Smith, and by implication Skip Bayless, but Stephen A. Smith was one who came on his show, and Dan Le Batard said, quote, "I hate what you two have done to sports television," unquote, kind of in relation to how he sees First Take as having created this environment of sports media being dominated by debate in this kind of embrace debate model of television. And he questions why executives have decided that essentially, quote, being loud and wrong, unquote, while yelling at the person across from you is what makes good TV, because that's often what we see in those types of shows, such as First Take. It's just two, multiple people, sometimes just two, sometimes more, but it's all just, can you get your hot take off? Who can kind of yell the loudest about their take, right? That's kind of the premise of Embrace Debate. And he contrasts that to shows such as Outside the Lines, High Noon, E60, and The Sports Reporters, none of which are around anymore, even though arguably we need them now more than ever, he says. And instead we have people like Skip Bayless, he also names Emmanuel Ocho and Chris Russo, as kind of people that fall into this mold of Embrace Debate that he's critiquing. Now, Bomani Jones, right, Game Theory is also another show that fits more into this line, this lineage of Outside the Lines, High Noon, E60, Sports Reporters, right? Not in the sense that Bomani Jones was doing sports journalism, but rather that he was doing kind of larger analysis of things related to sports, right? He wasn't just talking about the game last night or whether LeBron should be the GOAT or whatever, right? He was doing a different sort of analysis. But the show ultimately had low ratings and was canceled. And Karen Phillips says basically this shows that in a sense the executives were correct, right? And that people want the Embrace Debate style. But crucially, right, he's not saying that that's a good thing. And he ends the article basically by blaming us, right? He's like, whose fault is this? It's your fault, right? For the state of sports media, right? Basically when you're watching sports media and wondering, why is it like this, right? He says it's because us, right, didn't tune into Game Theory as much as we tune into those debate style shows, and so we end up with less thoughtfulness and more debate. Okay, so what do I think of all this, right? Firstly, right, I agree overwhelmingly with where he's coming from, like, first and foremost. I mean, he's writing this at a moment when game theory has just been canceled, and he's angry, right, as he should be, because it was a thoughtful show, a good show, and just wasn't able to stick around. And especially if you were a fan of the show, right, anyone would be kind of angry that it's canceled. And I'll sort of touch on the end kind of as I go here, but I think you can kind of, especially if you read the article, which you should, right? I don't know necessarily that's totally fair just to blame the readers, right? Because there's a lot of factors that are kind of going on here. And, as I'll say in a second too, right? I mean, we've also seen some positive developments as well. But you can still understand his anger at that moment, and I agree that we kind of should be angry about the overall state of sports media. I really think people that are 10 or more years younger than I myself am, right, really have no memory of what sports media used to be like. I know this from talking to people kind of in that age range and even a little bit younger, and they really don't understand, what's the problem. It's right. It's like kind of like, well, this is what people watch. This is what sports media is. What's the problem? I don't think they even have a memory that there was something different than this at some point. And I think it's interesting, though, reflecting on this 3 years later, because we actually kind of have made, I won't say we've made a recovery, right? Things are still pretty grim. But, for example, right, even if you just think about Bomani, right, his HBO show was canceled, and certainly that was, one of the bigger platforms that he would have had, especially at this stage of his career, right, when he was younger. He was on ESPN, had a pretty big platform there, was fired from ESPN. HBO also offered a big platform. But if you want to watch Bomani Jones, he's still on YouTube. He has a podcast, sort of podcast / YouTube show. And he uploads multiple times a week, right? So you're not at a loss to kind of still get that analysis. It's just on a different platform. And I think in general, right, we've seen a lot of really talented people who are on social media, YouTube, podcasts, whatever. And it's kind of just a different media landscape, right? I think that's kind of part of it. ESPN even itself is kind of trying to adapt to this new media landscape and have probably, well, from kind of the standpoint of wanting rigorous sports coverage, have not really done so successfully. But just from a rating standpoint, I guess the jury is perhaps still out on that. So I think there's an open question, right? If they didn't have the live sports, would people tune into ESPN at all? I don't really know, but so that's why I say the jury is still a little bit out there, right? But and so in some sense, what Phillips wants, like this return to this old style, maybe it's just different in some ways. Maybe you can still find certain things. You just have to look in other places, and that maybe is bad, but maybe it's just also different. But mine is still out there. But what I will point out too, and especially on the point of having these podcasts, YouTube shows, whatever, Pablo Torre finds out, right, is one of the greatest sports journalism shows really of all time. I mean, it's at least up there with any of the shows that Phillips mentions in his article, but honestly may even exceed some of them by quite a margin. I mean, Pablo Torre just literally won a Pulitzer Prize, right, for his reporting on the kind of Steve Ballmer, Kawhi Leonard cap circumvention situation, which is its own thing. If you don't know about it, you should go watch Pablo Torre's multiple episodes on that. But I just mentioned to say, right, I mean, if you want, and Pablo Torre finds out was not really around when Phillips wrote this article. I mean, I'd have to check the exact date when it started, but it certainly was not a big phenomenon like it is now, and he wrote this article. So that's why I said, we haven't made a full recovery, but if you want rigorous sports journalism, it's still out there. And Pablo's show is popular too, right? I mean, not just in terms of viewers, right, but the Pulitzer, right? It's recognized by serious journalists and his peers in that sense. So it's not necessarily all doom and gloom, right? Even though Beaumont's show got canceled for low ratings, people who want that content are still out there and still watching, right? Just looks a little bit different. But, right, again, to go back to Philip's overall point, right? I'm not trying to say that, things are all solved now, because I think the overall degradation of the media landscape, on one hand, Pablo Torre has won his Pulitzer. On the other hand, it's like, okay, why is he the only one covering this? Even for what it's worth, Beaumont Jones has mostly been dismissive of this whole Kawhi Leonard, Steve Ballmer story. There's a few other people, right, and some of the local media people or whatever are asking questions, but it at times it really feels like it's just Pablo, and he's even kind of said on his show, the same question, right? Why are other people not getting on, right? Inviting other people to join in on this. But, right, and the point I'm trying to make here, that's one part of it, right? Why he's we have him, but why is he the only one, right? So that's kind of a negative. But also then, I don't even think that you could have, right, this sort of, you couldn't have this alleged cap circumvention issue if you still had a rigorous sports media in the first place, right? I mean, this should have been something that got picked up much more quickly than it was, and should have many more people on it, right? It shouldn't be that the Clippers are essentially able to just kind of ignore it at this point. I mean, they still get asked some questions, but really are just kind of, the Clippers as well as Adam Silver, it's all kind of just like, oh, well, now the independent, quote unquote, independent law firm is investigating. Again, I won't get into the details there, but and they just kind of leave it at that. And some people are still trying to push, but for the most part, we just see people kind of trying to move on from it, and we'll see what the NBA decides here, hopefully soon, maybe by the time this comes out even. And so I think, this is also emblematic then of kind of these larger media and societal problems. I think journalism in this country has just been degraded in general. As someone who tried to, at least considered kind of going into journalism, I did a lot with journalism when I was in high school and undergrad, and basically was told, right, like, you can't really have a career, certainly not as a print journalist. I mean, you could get into video and try and do it that way, but even then, right, kind of no guarantees. And what I didn't quite appreciate at the time, but was sort of the implication, was even if you do get a job as a video journalist, right, probably not going to be paid particularly well, certainly not at the beginning. I mean, your local news reporter very well might be making less per hour, and they are paid hourly, and they might be paid less per hour than your local fast food worker, right? And no disrespect to the fast food workers, but for something that I think we consider the type of job in terms of journalism that you kind of need to be trained on, we have, you can get a degree in journalism, right? I mean, there's sort of this implication that if you are in this field, right, that you're going to be paid commensurate with the time you spend training and going to school for it, right? As I said, like, fast food workers certainly are working hard as well, but generally in society, right, that's not how we think of people's compensation for what they do. And so it's hard to, and just like a lot of fast food workers eventually leave, right? A lot of local journalists eventually leave, right? Because the pay is just not there. Part of this maybe, right, is the same thing that Phillips is talking about in his article, right? Why was Bomani Jones canceled? Well, people weren't tuning in. Why is local media and media in general, right, the way it is? Well, maybe it's because people are not tuning in, right? People would rather tune in to some talking head, right, on Fox News yelling about immigration or whatever, right, than actually have a scholar on the border, right, talking about the history of immigration, and kind of doing a breakdown of the actual, right, effects of policy, right? And no one wants to hear that. Not no one, but not enough people want to hear that. They'd rather just hear someone that they already agree with kind of come on and just yell. And we even see this, right? Sometimes in traditional media, they'll have this kind of embrace debate style, almost multiple people on kind of yelling at each other. You also obviously see this in social media, something like YouTube, like a channel like Jubilee, sort of but Jubilee has got to be, one of the worst kind of channels on YouTube, especially in terms of this issue that I'm talking about here, where it's like, do you actually learn anything watching a Jubilee video? Well, no, not really, right? I mean, if you're not familiar with it, it's basically the same thing where, it's like, okay, and there's a few different formats they have of it, but basically they bring in opposing sides, and it's kind of like people just kind of give their takes. Sometimes sometimes they bring on like experts, but they're weighed equally. They might have scientists versus flat earthers or something, right? This is like an actual episode, and they kind of just present you both groups of people, and there's not really a sense that one is right and the other is wrong. They kind of just both yell at each other for a little bit. I mean, to the scientists' credit, they're trying to explain these basic concepts of why we know the Earth is not flat, but the structure of the channel itself doesn't really care about the right answer, right? They just want to have the two sides in contrast, right? But even, social media, whatever, right? You're on Instagram Reels, TikTok, whatever, right? I mean, what are you going to see? Whatever the algorithm decides to show you, generally someone kind of talking into the camera for 30 seconds to a minute, whatever, and almost inevitably they'll be saying something that you already agree with because that's what the algorithm wants to show you. Or it might show you someone you disagree with, but for the point of kind of rage bait, right? Like someone who is ostensibly supposed to be seen as obviously wrong, right? So that you comment on how wrong they are, right? I mean, these are kind of like the two modes of engagement that were kind of force fed a lot. And so I think really this is how we kind of end up with someone like Donald Trump, right, being able to do what he's doing in terms of, right, I mean, if you look at the numbers, he's profited more off the presidency than any other president in history by a comically wide margin, and he's done it through his things like cryptocurrency and alleged, right, insider stock trading. And it's like there is some coverage on it, but his supporters don't really care, right? And I think even some of the critics of Trump, I mean, there's some great analysis of what's kind of going on with the alleged Trump corruption, but I think you also see people who are happy to just simply read an article that someone else wrote to you and just kind of look at it and say, wow, isn't this terrible? Like and subscribe and support me on Patreon, right? Like, there's not, we're not really in a state where we have people that are kind of coming on and actually analyzing this. Again, those people are out there, and you should look for them, right? But I think they're not necessarily what is most visible to us, right? And they're not visible to us specifically because people aren't looking for them, right? So it's, we kind of, that's where I sort of agree with Phillips, right? Even though these people are out there and people are watching them, right? We see that they're just not being watched or listened to or read or whatever in great enough numbers to kind of signal to whether it's these algorithms or these companies or these platforms or whatever, right? That they should give us more of that. So, what is the answer to all this? It's hard to say for sure. I think at a bare minimum, we need to kind of restore and continue the government support of organizations like PBS and NPR. The more that the government kind of supports journalism, I think is a good thing, especially for the people working there. Obviously, it doesn't totally solve, right, the issue that Phillips is talking about, right? HBO is still going to cancel Beaumont Jones, right? Even if we have a more robust environment of support for journalism at the governmental level. I do think, right, even though the situation maybe is a little bit less dire than Phillips kind of portrays it as, or maybe has become less dire in the last few years, I do still think that he's kind of right that people, even at the individual level, do need to actively resist kind of some of the easy mush that we get in the media, and look for that more rigorous analysis. But I also think, kind of even more generally, that we just need more of a sense of care, because I think there's this sense that people, if it's not about making money, then why should I care about it, right? Even with sports, right? And sports particularly, I think, because it seems kind of frivolous, right? Even though it's really not, because when you get down to it, it's, it's these billionaire owners, and when they decide to build a stadium, they're taking your taxpayer money to do it, right? So there are these very real kind of implications for it. But whatever, the game last night can seem kind of frivolous, and so it's like, okay, well, why does it even need to be fair, right? So what if a billionaire owner cheated to stack his team and broke the league rules to do it, right? That doesn't put money in my pocket, right? I mean, that's a sense that people have, right? Why do sports need to be fair? And you could even go at the micro level, right? I mean, I think we see this in schools right now and stuff, especially with AI, right? It's like, well, okay, why do I need to do my homework, right? Why do I need to write this essay? But even in the workplace, right? Why do I need to write this email, right? AI can do it or whatever. It's not financially benefiting me. It doesn't matter if this is done unethically or sloppily, or if I'm destroying the environment to do this or whatever, right? And then even going at a higher level, why shouldn't the president do a crypto rug pull, right? Allegedly, I didn't fall for it, doesn't personally affect me. Or maybe I did fall for it, but, that was my choice, and it's a free country. The president can allegedly do a rug pull if he wants to, And I would say that all these things really are kind of connected, right? The sports, the homework, the crypto scams. Because once you give up on any sense of basic moral principles that aren't strictly financial, right? For example, it could be a moral principle that you should choose to educate yourself about something rather than choosing to remain ignorant about it when given the chance, right? If you give up on that, you really do open yourself up to being taken advantage of by the least scrupulous people in society. And really, at some point in your life, I mean, in small ways every day, but there will come a point in your life where you do need to think critically about something in order to avoid someone exploiting you. Whether it is the president rug pulling you, or, even just this, question of, how much should your boss be paying you, or, how much work should you be expected to do based on your salary, whatever, right? Or even in a relationship or whatever, like was equitable in this relationship, what sort of treatment is acceptable, right? You at some point, you're going to have to really think critically to avoid someone else exploiting you. And so you better start practicing now, right? Even if it is just with something as seemingly frivolous as sports. You do need to sort of decide to reject people just yelling at each other and actually think about, okay, what would be intellectually enriching for me? So I'll leave it there. I think it is an interesting article you should read for yourself, and kind of interesting to reflect on 3 years later. Some stuff I think has changed a little. A lot of the article I think is still pretty relevant to us now. I'm going to try to keep this show a little bit more regular than it has been, even if that does mean some more solo episodes. And probably for these solo episodes, I'll cut out the safe room. You've heard enough from me anyway. So with that, that'll be the show for today. See the show notes for a link to view the artifact for yourself and view the endnotes. Artwork, as always, by jasartstudios. The music was produced by Nicholas Pizzuto. Rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. Follow us on Facebook. Probably will try and branch out to other social media here. It's certainly Facebook is declining significance of Facebook is certainly a factor there. And tell a friend or enemy about the show. Join me again, hopefully soon, as I find another artifact to discuss.